Rose Parker clutched the thin eviction notice in her unsteady hands, the crumpled edges evidence of her anxious fidgeting over the last few days. The words, "Final Notice," glared back at her in harsh, bold lettering, and it felt like they were carved directly into her heart. She sat on her second-hand couch, staring blankly at her modest, run-down apartment. The wallpaper, once cheerful and floral, was now faded and peeling. Dark water stains stretched across the ceiling like permanent reminders of things left unrepaired, and the single window barely allowed enough sunlight to fight the gloom. It wasn't much, but it was the only home Rose had ever managed to make for herself after years of struggle. Her whispered words broke the suffocating silence, though they felt more like a plea than a plan. 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks, she murmured, her voice raw and brittle. Her eyes fell on the pile of unpaid bills that sat precariously atop her makeshift coffee table, a wooden crate she'd painted to look presentable. The sight mocked her, each unopened envelope another symbol of the life she'd been desperately trying to hold together. The loss of her last job as a housekeeper had come as a bitter blow. Her elderly employer, Mrs. Henderson, had passed away, and with her went Rose's steady paycheck. 3 months of fruitless job searching had left Rose's savings depleted, her refrigerator empty, and her hope dangling by a fragile thread. She pulled her frayed cardigan tighter around her thin frame, bracing herself against the cold drafts slipping through the apartment's poorly sealed windows. The building's heating system had been unreliable for years, a problem that was more pressing now than ever as the winter crept closer. She stared at the phone on the table, willing it to ring with some kind of miracle. But miracles weren't something Rose allowed herself to believe in anymore. Just as she was about to turn away, the shrill sound of her phone broke through her thoughts. She lunged for it with a mixture of desperation and dread. "Hello? Rose, it's Linda." The cheerful voice of her church friend immediately eased some of the tension in her chest. "Linda, hi." Rose tried to keep her voice steady, but her fatigue seeped through. "I think I found something for you," Linda said, her excitement palpable. "The Fairchild estate is looking for a new housekeeper. It pays really well, and they need someone to start immediately." Rose's stomach flipped. The Fairchilds? She could hardly believe it. Everyone in town knew about the Fairchild family. They owned half the businesses in the area and lived in a sprawling estate that looked like something out of a fairy tale. "Linda, they wouldn't hire someone like me. Well," Rose trailed off, embarrassed by her own self-doubt. "You stop that right now," Linda said firmly. "You're the hardest worker I know. Just go and try. What's the worst that could happen?" Rose hesitated, but Linda's unwavering belief in her began to chip away at her uncertainty. After jotting down the details, Rose hung up and sat in silence, the weight of the opportunity pressing against her shoulders. Determined not to let her nerves sabotage her, Rose spent the next hour preparing for the interview. She pulled her best dress out of the closet, a simple navy blue piece that she'd reserved for church or special occasions. Though it wasn't fancy, she ironed it with care, wanting to make the best impression possible. After carefully pinning back her shoulder-length brown hair and slipping on her scuffed but clean shoes, Rose grabbed her purse and made her way to the bus stop. The journey to the wealthier side of town felt longer than it was, each stop filling her with more doubt. She mentally rehearsed her answers to possible interview questions, gripping her purse tightly in her lap to keep her trembling hands steady. When the bus pulled up in front of the estate, Rose's breath caught in her throat. The Fairchild mansion was grander than anything she had imagined. The towering stone exterior gleamed in the midday sun, its expansive gardens meticulously manicured. Iron gates, adorned with intricate designs, stretched high above her head as if to keep out anything, or anyone, that didn't belong. Steeling herself, Rose pressed the intercom button at the entrance. The metallic click of the speaker made her jump. "Yes?" a stern voice demanded. "Hi, I'm Rose Parker. I'm here about the housekeeping position," she managed to say, her voice cracking slightly. There was a pause before the gates swung open with a mechanical hum. Rose stepped onto the gravel driveway, her shoes crunching loudly as she approached the front door. The woman who greeted her at the door was tall and imposing, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore a sharp, perfectly tailored uniform that seemed to mirror her no-nonsense demeanor. "You must be Ms. Parker," the woman said, her sharp gaze scanning Rose from head to toe. "Follow me. I'm Mrs. Ward, the head housekeeper." Rose nodded, clutching her purse as Mrs. Ward led her into a small but elegant office near the kitchen. The scent of freshly polished wood lingered in the air. The interview was brisk and to the point. Mrs. Ward fired questions at her, barely pausing for Rose to respond before jotting notes onto a clipboard. Previous experience. 5 years with Mrs. Henderson, Rose said, and 3 years with the Martin family before that. References? I have them here. Rose handed over a neatly typed sheet, her palms damp with sweat. As Mrs. Ward scanned the paper, Rose noticed a smudge on the edge of the desk. Without thinking, she pulled a tissue from her purse and wiped it away. Mrs. Ward's sharp eyes caught the gesture, and for a moment, her expression softened. "You can start today," Mrs. Ward said abruptly, standing and handing Rose a folded uniform. "You'll find the staff changing room down the hall. Be back here in 10 minutes. Relief washed over Rose so intensely that her knees felt weak. "Thank you, Mrs. Ward. I promise I won't let you down." The uniform felt foreign as Rose tied the apron strings behind her back in the staff changing room. The black dress, stiff with starch, and the white apron, crisply ironed, were worlds away from the soft, worn clothes she was used to. She caught her reflection in the mirror, a woman with tired eyes and a faint hope flickering behind them. Taking a deep breath, she whispered a prayer under her breath. "Thank you, Lord. Please let me do this right." The mansion's grandeur was even more overwhelming once Rose stepped into the main hall. Towering windows let in golden streams of sunlight that danced across the polished marble floors. A massive crystal chandelier hung overhead, its cascading tiers of glass sparkling like 1,000 tiny stars. Every detail of the space spoke of wealth and privilege, from the intricate crown molding to the gilded frames of oil paintings that lined the walls. "Punctuality! Good!" Mrs. Ward's voice rang out sharply as she approached, her heels clicking against the floor. Rose straightened instinctively, clutching the cleaning supplies she'd been handed. "Follow me," Mrs. Ward instructed curtly, motioning for Rose to keep up. The tour of the mansion was both awe-inspiring and overwhelming. Mrs. Ward moved quickly, pointing out priceless antiques and fragile heirlooms that required careful attention. "This," she said, gesturing to a lacquered mahogany desk, "is an original Chippendale. You'll polish it with the cloth I provide. Nothing else. And over there, the vases are 18th century Chinese porcelain. Dust them gently with a feather duster or you'll answer to me." "Yes, ma'am," Rose replied, her voice steady though her heart raced. The dining room, with its long table that could easily seat 20, had a tea service so fine that it seemed a crime to touch it. "The silver tray is for Mr. Fairchild's tea, never the brass. Do you understand?" Rose nodded again, trying to commit every instruction to memory. The day passed in a blur of cleaning, scrubbing, and polishing. Rose worked diligently, her arms aching by the afternoon. She had cleaned guest bedrooms larger than her entire apartment, polished mirrors that reflected her tired but determined face, and scrubbed floors so spotless they gleamed. Yet she felt a quiet satisfaction. This job, no matter how demanding, was a lifeline. While dusting the library's massive bookshelves, Rose overheard voices drifting from the hallway outside. She paused, careful not to make a sound. "Mr. Fairchild's coming back tomorrow," one voice whispered. "Really?" replied another, tinged with unease. "You know how he gets. Everything has to be perfect, or someone's head will roll." The two voices belonged to other maids, Janet and Clara, who were standing just outside the door. Rose pressed herself against the bookshelf, straining to hear. "Last month he fired the gardener because the roses weren't blooming properly," Janet continued, her voice low. "That's nothing," Clara whispered back. "You didn't hear what happened to his last business partner. Complete destruction. The man lost everything." Their voices faded as they moved further down the hall, leaving Rose with a strange sense of unease. Mr. Fairchild's reputation as a ruthless businessman was no secret, but the fear in the maid's voices added a new layer to his image. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Rose found herself assigned to polish the floor in the east wing. The long corridor was lined with imposing portraits of the Fairchild ancestors. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her every move as she knelt to work the wax into the hardwood. Her solitude was interrupted by the sound of small footsteps. Looking up, she saw a boy no older than 5 wandering down the hall. He was dressed in crisp khaki shorts and a neatly tucked-in polo shirt, his dark curls bouncing as he moved. He stopped in front of a large portrait, tilting his head in curiosity as he studied it. Rose's heart skipped a beat. Something about the boy seemed eerily familiar. Her eyes drifted to the left side of his neck, where a small, heart-shaped birthmark rested just below his ear. Her breath caught in her throat. That birthmark. It was identical to the one she remembered tracing on her newborn son's delicate skin. The memory came rushing back with the force of a tidal wave, the tiny baby she had held for only a fleeting moment before he was taken from her. The boy turned, his wide brown eyes meeting hers. Rose felt a lump rise in her throat. Those eyes. They were her eyes. Before she could process what she was seeing, a voice rang out. "Elijah!" A woman in her late 50s, wearing a prim maid's uniform, hurried down the hallway. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be with your tutor." "I was just looking at the pictures," the boy said softly. The maid, whose name tag read Martha, grabbed his hand gently but firmly. "Come along now. You know your father doesn't like you wandering about." Rose watched them leave, her legs too weak to stand. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile what she'd just witnessed. That boy, Elijah, was her son. He had to be. She could feel it deep in her bones, the same way she'd known it the moment she held him for the first and only time. Her knees buckled and she sank to the floor, her hands gripping the edge of the waxed surface for support. Tears filled her eyes as the truth crashed over her. Her baby, the child she had mourned for 5 years, was alive. The next morning, the sun streamed through the mansion's grand foyer as Rose returned to her duties. But her thoughts were miles away. She couldn't stop thinking about Elijah. How had he ended up here? And why had she been told he had died? She busied herself polishing the grand staircase's banister, her hands moving automatically as her mind churned. She needed answers, but where would she even begin? Confronting the Fairchilds directly was out of the question. Mrs. Ward's icy demeanor alone made Rose certain that this household operated under strict rules of silence and obedience. "Morning, Rose," a kind voice said from behind her. She turned to see Linda, the same church friend who had recommended the job. Linda worked as a laundress in the mansion's lower levels and often had a smile for anyone who crossed her path. "Morning," Rose replied, trying to mask the storm brewing inside her. "You okay?" Linda asked, her brow furrowing. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Rose hesitated, then forced a weak smile. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." Linda didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press. Instead, she handed Rose a neatly folded stack of linens. "Here, these are for the West Wing bedrooms. Mrs. Ward wants everything perfect before Mr. Fairchild returns." "Thanks," Rose said, taking the linens. As Linda walked away, Rose felt a flicker of gratitude for her friend's kindness. But the question lingered. How could she get closer to Elijah without raising suspicion? The weight of her discovery pressed heavily on Rose's chest as she went about her tasks in the Fairchild mansion. Every polished banister, every dusted vase, and every swept corridor was a reminder of how close she was to the son she had mourned for years. Elijah. The name echoed in her mind with a bittersweet melody. She whispered it softly to herself as if testing its weight on her tongue. Late in the afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the estate's west wing, Rose found herself assigned to tidy up Elijah's playroom. She hesitated at the door, her heart thundering in her chest. The faint sound of laughter and soft humming drifted from inside. Pushing the door open quietly, Rose stepped into a child's wonderland. The walls were painted a soft sky blue, dotted with murals of whimsical clouds and soaring birds. Toys were scattered across the plush rug, brightly colored wooden blocks, model airplanes, and neatly arranged action figures. In the corner, Elijah sat cross-legged, his small hands carefully placing tiny superheroes in what appeared to be a battle scene. He didn't notice her at first, too engrossed in his imaginative play. Rose swallowed hard, her breath hitching as she watched him. The curve of his cheek, the way his little brow furrowed in concentration. It was as though she were staring at a piece of herself that she hadn't known was missing. "Do you like superheroes?" she asked softly, crouching down to pick up a block that had rolled near her feet. Elijah's head snapped up, his big brown eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, he simply stared at her, as though trying to place her face in his young memory. Then he smiled, shy but warm. "Yeah, this one's my favorite." He held up a brightly colored figure with a flowing cape. "He saves people who need help." Rose felt a lump rise in her throat. "That's a very important job," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And what about the others?" Elijah leaned forward, his little hands eagerly showing off his collection. "This one can fly, and this one is super strong." He paused, holding up a smaller figure. "And this one helps people find their families." Rose's hands stilled on the blanket she had been folding. Her breath caught as her chest tightened painfully. "That's a very special power," she whispered. "Sometimes families need a little help finding each other." Elijah tilted his head, studying her with a curious expression. "You're new here. The other ladies don't talk to me much." Rose forced a small smile. "Well, I'd like to talk to you, if you'd like that." Elijah's face brightened. "Yeah. Do you know any superhero stories?" Before Rose could respond, a sharp voice cut through the moment. "Elijah." She turned to see Mrs. Ward standing in the doorway, her stern expression even more severe than usual. "You know you're not supposed to disturb Master Elijah during his playtime," she said, her disapproval directed squarely at Rose. "I was just tidying up," Rose said quickly, rising to her feet. "The toys can wait," Mrs. Ward said, her tone clipped. "Mr. Fairchild has very specific rules regarding his son. Come with me. There's work to be done in the dining room." Rose nodded, casting one last glance at Elijah before following Mrs. Ward out of the room. The boy had already turned back to his superheroes, but Rose couldn't shake the ache in her heart. She had been so close to a piece of herself she thought she'd lost forever. As the days passed, Rose found herself caught in a web of longing and fear. She wanted desperately to get closer to Elijah, to learn more about him and the life he had been living. But the rules of the household were strict, and the staff operated under an unspoken code of silence. One night, after most of the staff had retired to their quarters, Rose remained awake. The mansion's grand halls were eerily quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of a grandfather clock. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows, casting pale beams across the polished floors. Rose's hands trembled as she clutched the broom she had been using as a pretense to linger in the east wing. She had been drawn here, unable to ignore the magnetic pull of Elijah's presence just a few rooms away. Her feet moved almost of their own accord, carrying her closer to the doorway of the nursery where he slept. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her ears. The soft creak of floorboards behind her made her freeze. Slowly, she turned, her stomach twisting into knots. There, standing in the dim light, was Mr. Fairchild. He was a tall man, his broad shoulders and commanding presence filling the space. His sharp, angular features were accentuated by the shadows, and his dark eyes bore into hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Rose's mouth went dry. "I was just finishing up some cleaning, sir," she stammered, clutching the broom tighter. His eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something. Recognition, perhaps? But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Next time, finish your work during the day," he said curtly. "The East Wing is off limits after hours." Yes, sir, Rose murmured, bowing her head. He lingered for a moment longer, his gaze heavy on her before turning and walking away. The sound of his retreating footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, leaving Rose standing alone in the silence. Her hands trembled as she resumed her sweeping, but her mind was racing. Did he recognize her? Did he remember the young woman he had once charmed and abandoned? Or was she just another nameless employee to him now? The following morning, Rose stood in the mansion's kitchen, carefully arranging breakfast trays. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the air, but her appetite was non-existent. Linda, who was folding linens nearby, noticed Rose's pale face. "You look like you didn't sleep a wink," she said, her voice laced with concern. "I didn't," Rose admitted, her hands trembling slightly as she set a teacup on a silver tray. "Something's bothering you," Linda said gently. "Do you want to talk about it?" Rose hesitated, torn between her desire to confide in someone and the fear of revealing too much. "It's just this place. It's overwhelming." Linda nodded knowingly. "It can be. The Fairchilds run a tight ship, and Mr. Fairchild, well, let's just say he doesn't make it easy." "What do you mean?" Rose asked, her curiosity piqued. Linda glanced around to make sure no one was listening before lowering her voice. "He's a perfectionist. Everything has to be just so. And when it comes to Elijah, he's incredibly protective. Nobody talks about his mother, and he doesn't let the boy out of his sight for long." Rose's chest tightened at the mention of Elijah. "It must be hard for a little boy to live like that," she said softly. Linda studied her for a moment, her brow furrowing. "You seem awfully interested in Elijah. Why?" Rose forced a weak smile. I feel for him. He seems lonely." Linda's expression softened. "He is. Poor kid. But be careful, Rose. Mr. Fairchild doesn't take kindly to people getting too close to his son." Rose nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of Linda's warning. She would have to tread carefully. That evening, as the mansion's halls grew quieter and the other staff retired to their rooms, Rose lay awake in her tiny quarters. The thin mattress offered little comfort, and the dim light of the street lamp outside her small window cast uneven patterns across the ceiling. Her mind raced, replaying every moment she had spent near Elijah, every glance, every word. The way his small hands had held the superhero with the power to reunite families. The way he had looked at her as if he recognized something familiar. And then there was Desmond Fairchild, his sharp gaze, his commanding presence, and the faint flicker of recognition she thought she had seen in his eyes. She turned onto her side, reaching for the small box she kept hidden beneath her bed. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was a photograph. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the paper, revealing the Polaroid she had clung to for 5 years. The image was grainy, taken in the hospital just moments after her son was born. She was cradling him in her arms, her face flushed with exhaustion and joy. Even in the blurry photograph, the heart-shaped birthmark below his tiny ear was unmistakable. Her eyes welled with tears as she traced the outline of the baby's face with her finger. "Elijah," she whispered. The name felt like a prayer, a plea, a promise. But now that she knew he was alive, that he was so close, the questions gnawed at her. Why had she been told he had died? Who had orchestrated this lie? And why was he here, living as the son of the man who had once abandoned her? The answers seemed impossibly out of reach, buried under layers of wealth, power, and deceit. But one thing was certain: she would not lose him again. The next morning, Rose moved through her tasks with quiet determination. The staff was abuzz with preparations for Desmond Fairchild's return. Every surface was polished to a mirror shine, every room inspected with meticulous precision. Rose found herself in the dining room, setting the long table with the finest china and silverware. She worked carefully, her movements deliberate as she arranged each piece according to Mrs. Ward's exacting instructions. As she straightened one of the crystal glasses, she overheard two maids whispering near the doorway. "Did you hear? Mr. Fairchild extended his trip again," one of them said. "He won't be back until tomorrow." Rose felt a flicker of relief. The delay gave her more time to think, to plan. She needed to find a way to uncover the truth about Elijah without drawing too much attention to herself. After finishing her tasks, Rose returned to the kitchen, where Linda was folding a fresh batch of linens. "Linda," Rose began hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," Linda said, glancing up. "Have you ever seen any photos of Elijah when he was a baby?" Linda frowned. "No, I don't think so. Why?" I was wondering if he's always lived here," Rose said carefully. Linda's expression grew cautious. "Rose, you've got to be careful. Asking questions like that could get you into trouble. Mr. Fairchild doesn't like anyone prying into his personal life." "I know," Rose said quickly. "I didn't mean to—" Linda sighed, softening. "I know you mean well, but trust me, it's better not to get involved. The Fairchilds, they're not like us. They have their own rules, their own ways of doing things." Rose nodded, biting her lip to keep from saying more. That night, as the mansion settled into its usual stillness, Rose decided to take a risk. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed answers. The staff quarters were quiet as she slipped out of her room, clutching a flashlight she had borrowed from the supply closet. The air in the mansion felt heavier at night, the silence broken only by the faint creaks of the old house settling. Rose made her way toward the West Wing, where she knew Desmond Fairchild's private study was located. If there were any records or photographs that could confirm Elijah's true identity, they would likely be there. Her heart pounded as she approached the study door. The ornate wood paneling gleamed in the dim light, and the brass doorknob felt cool under her trembling hand. She twisted it slowly, holding her breath as the latch clicked open. The room was dark, but the faint glow of the moon through the tall windows illuminated the outlines of bookshelves, a large desk, and a leather armchair. Rose stepped inside, closing the door behind her as quietly as possible. She moved to the desk, her flashlight casting a narrow beam of light across its surface. Papers were neatly arranged in stacks, and a sleek laptop sat in the center. She hesitated, unsure where to begin. Her hands shook as she opened the top drawer, revealing a collection of files. She rifled through them quickly, her eyes scanning for anything that mentioned Elijah. Finally, she found a folder labeled Adoption Records. Her breath caught as she opened it. Inside were legal documents detailing Elijah's adoption, along with a birth certificate listing Desmond Fairchild as his father and mother unknown, in the space where her name should have been. Tears blurred her vision as she stared at the papers. Her son had been taken from her and given a new identity, a new life. And yet, here he was, living under the same roof as her. A noise from the hallway made her freeze. Footsteps. She quickly closed the drawer and turned off the flashlight, her heart racing. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the door. Rose pressed herself against the wall, praying whoever it was would move on. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, and the hallway fell silent once more. Rose let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she slipped out of the study and back into the shadows of the mansion. The following day, Rose's mind was a whirlwind as she worked. She had the proof she needed, but what could she do with it? Desmond Fairchild was a powerful man, and she was just a housekeeper. If she confronted him, he could easily deny everything, and worse, he could have her fired, cutting her off from Elijah completely. Her thoughts were interrupted when Mrs. Ward approached her in the kitchen. "Mr. Fairchild has requested your assistance in the library this afternoon," she said, her tone as cold as ever. Rose's stomach twisted into knots. She had managed to avoid Desmond since their brief encounter in the hallway, but now there would be no escaping him. When the appointed time came, Rose made her way to the library. Desmond was already there, standing by one of the tall bookshelves with his back to her. "You wanted to see me, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. He turned slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a moment, He simply studied her, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said finally. "I wanted to ask you something." Rose's heart pounded as she waited for him to continue. "You seem familiar," he said, his voice measured. "Have we met before?" Her breath caught in her throat. Did he remember? Did he know who she was? "I don't believe so, sir," she said carefully, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Desmond narrowed his eyes as though trying to place her face. Perhaps I'm mistaken." He turned back to the bookshelf, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "That will be all." Rose nodded quickly and left the room, her legs trembling as she walked down the hall. She had managed to keep her composure, but she knew the battle was far from over. The weight of Linda's words lingered in the air, as heavy as the truth that now filled Rose's chest. She had known from the moment she saw Elijah that he was her son, but holding scientific proof in her hands made it undeniable. For 5 years, she had carried the unbearable burden of believing her child was gone, stolen by the cruel lies of a system tilted in favor of power and privilege. Now she had a weapon, the truth. As Linda closed the door behind her, giving Rose a moment of privacy, Rose leaned against the cool metal of the locker. Her fingers brushed against the paper in her pocket, the DNA test results that had both broken and rebuilt her in an instant. The realization that Elijah was alive, that she had been lied to, manipulated, and robbed of the most precious years of his life, set her nerves on fire. Her reflection in the locker's small mirror startled her. The woman staring back had dark circles under her eyes, cheeks flushed with anger and grief, but there was also a spark of something fierce, something unstoppable. "I won't let him win," Rose whispered, her voice firm despite the tears threatening to spill. She forced herself to take a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and stepped out of the staff quarters. The mansion's halls stretched before her, vast and silent, their grandeur now feeling cold and oppressive. Every ornate detail, every polished surface, seemed to mock her, a reminder of Desmond King's wealth and influence. But Rose had something he didn't, the bond of a mother and her child, a bond she was determined to reclaim. The following morning, Rose moved through her tasks with mechanical precision. Her body worked on autopilot as her mind churned, planning her next steps. She polished silver, dusted shelves, and fluffed pillows, all while keeping her thoughts carefully guarded. The mansion's other staff members bustled around her, preparing for another one of Mr. King's high-profile business lunches. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew how exacting Mr. King could be when it came to entertaining his powerful guests. "Rose!" Mrs. Ward's sharp voice broke through her thoughts. Rose straightened immediately, her cleaning rag still in hand. "Yes, ma'am?" "Finish up in here and then head to the dining room. The table arrangements need adjusting," Mrs. Ward instructed. "Yes, ma'am," Rose replied, keeping her tone neutral. She finished dusting quickly and made her way to the grand dining room. The table was already set with the finest china and crystal, but Rose's practiced eye caught a few minor imperfections, a slightly crooked fork, a water goblet just a hair off-center. She adjusted each one with care, her fingers steady despite the turmoil inside her. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The sensation sent a shiver down her spine. But when she glanced toward the doorway, it was empty. Still, the mansion's ever-present security cameras reminded her that nothing here went unnoticed. By the time lunch was served, Rose was stationed with the rest of the staff near the kitchen, ready to bring in the next course. The dining room buzzed with conversation as Mr. King and his guests discussed business deals and market trends, their voices rising and falling like the hum of an expensive machine. Rose caught snippets of their conversation as she moved in and out with trays of food. "Tech startup valuations are volatile right now," one man was saying, "but if anyone can make the right move, it's you, Desmond." Mr. King's deep laugh resonated through the room. "That's why I always say, control the narrative, and you control the outcome." Rose's grip on the tray tightened. His words felt too close to the truth of her own situation, a reminder of how he had controlled her narrative for years, rewriting her story to suit his needs. As she placed a fresh platter of roasted vegetables on the table, Mr. King's gaze met hers. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. His dark eyes, sharp and calculating, bore into her as if he were trying to uncover the secrets she was so carefully guarding. "Miss Parker?" he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the chatter. Rose's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, sir? I trust the staff has everything under control?" His tone was pleasant, but there was an undercurrent of warning. "Of course, sir," Rose replied, keeping her voice steady. "Good." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before turning back to his guests. Rose hurried back to the kitchen, her pulse racing. The encounter left her shaken but more resolved than ever. Mr. King might suspect her, but he didn't know what she had. Not yet. Later that evening, Rose found herself in the garden, her hands deep in the soil as she tended to the flower beds. The rhythmic motion of pulling weeds and patting down fresh dirt helped calm her nerves. The scent of earth and blooming roses surrounded her, a small comfort in the midst of her turmoil. She heard a soft rustling behind her and turned to see Elijah standing a few feet away, clutching his ever-present stuffed elephant. "Miss Rose?" he said shyly, his small voice carrying across the quiet garden. Rose smiled, her heart swelling at the sight of him. "Hello, Elijah. What brings you out here?" "I wanted to see the flowers," he said, walking closer. "They're so pretty." "They are," Rose agreed. "Would you like to help me plant some new ones?" Elijah's face lit up. "Can I?" "Of course," Rose said, pulling out a small trowel and handing it to him. The two of them worked side by side, planting bright marigolds and soft lavender. Rose showed him how to dig small holes and gently pat the soil around the roots. Elijah's laughter filled the air as he accidentally got dirt on his nose, and Rose found herself laughing too, a rare moment of lightness in the midst of her storm. As they worked, Elijah looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Miss Rose, can I ask you something?" "Anything," Rose said, her voice gentle. "Do you think my mommy misses me?" he asked, his tone serious. Rose's breath caught. She paused, her hands frozen in the soil. "I think," she said carefully, "that your mommy loves you very much, and if she could, she'd do anything to be with you." Elijah seemed to consider this, nodding solemnly. "I think about her sometimes. I wonder what she looks like." Rose bit her lip, fighting back the tears threatening to spill. She wanted so badly to tell him the truth, to hold him and promise that she would never leave him again. But she couldn't. Not yet. "Maybe one day you'll find out," she said softly. Elijah smiled, a small but hopeful smile that made Rose's heart ache. Maybe. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and secrecy for Rose. The weight of her knowledge, combined with the ever-watchful presence of Mr. King and his staff, turned every moment into a delicate balancing act. The DNA test results felt like a loaded weapon hidden in her pocket, and with each passing day, the urge to use it grew stronger. In the garden, while trimming the hedges, Linda approached her cautiously. The older woman glanced over her shoulder to make sure no one else was nearby before speaking in hushed tones. "Rose, I've been hearing things," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rose straightened, her hands still gripping the hedge shears. "What kind of things?" "Ms. Anders has been keeping an eye on you," Linda warned. "She's been asking questions. Where you go during your breaks, who you talk to. I think Mr. King's suspicious." Rose's chest tightened, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. "Suspicious of what?" Linda gave her a pointed look. "You know what? I don't think he knows everything, but he's watching." Rose exhaled slowly, her mind racing. "Thank you for telling me." Linda hesitated, her brow furrowed with worry. "Rose, be careful. Mr. King doesn't play fair. If he feels threatened, he'll act before you have a chance to defend yourself." "I know," Rose said, her voice firm, "but I'm not backing down. Not now." Linda sighed, but nodded. "Just promise me you'll be smart about it." I promise." As Linda walked away, Rose returned to her work, but her mind was elsewhere. The pressure was mounting, and she knew she was running out of time. If Mr. King suspected her, he wouldn't hesitate to use his power to crush her. She had to act soon, but she needed to be strategic. Later that evening, Rose was assigned to clean the east wing of the mansion, including Mr. King's private office. The staff had strict instructions not to disturb his belongings, but Rose couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she needed might be hidden there. When she entered the office, her heart raced. The room was exactly as she remembered from her previous encounter, imposing and meticulously organized. A large mahogany desk dominated the space, flanked by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. The faint scent of cigars and polished wood lingered in the air. Rose began cleaning carefully, wiping down surfaces and dusting the shelves. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning for anything that might give her an edge. On the desk, a folder caught her attention. It was labeled Family Trust, and the papers inside were neatly clipped together. Rose hesitated, glancing at the door to ensure she was alone before opening the folder. Her breath hitched as she skimmed the contents. The documents detailed financial arrangements for Elijah's future, including a trust fund worth millions. One line, however, stood out. Legal guardian, Desmond King. Rose's hands shook as she replaced the folder. The enormity of Mr. King's control over Elijah's life was staggering. He had not only stolen her son, but ensured that every aspect of his future was tied to his influence. She finished cleaning quickly, her nerves frayed. As she left the office, she couldn't help but feel that Mr. King's grip on Elijah was tighter than she had realized. The next morning, Rose was in the nursery, tidying up while Elijah played with his toys. The boy's innocent chatter was a bright spot in her otherwise heavy day. "Miss Rose," Elijah said, holding up a drawing he had just finished. "Look, it's you and me." Rose knelt beside him, her heart swelling at the sight. The drawing showed two figures holding hands, one with curly brown hair, the other a small boy with a bright smile. "It's beautiful, Elijah," Rose said, her voice thick with emotion. "Do you like it?" he asked, his eyes wide with hope. "I love it," Rose replied, pulling him into a hug. The moment was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Rose released Elijah quickly, standing as Ms. Anders entered the room. "Miss Parker," Ms. Anders said sharply. "A word, please." Rose followed her out into the hallway, her heart pounding. "I've noticed you spending a lot of time with Master Elijah," Ms. Anders said, her tone icy. "That is not your role here. Your duties are to clean, not to engage with the family." Rose bit her lip, forcing herself to remain calm. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to overstep." "See that you don't," Ms. Anders said, her gaze narrowing. "Mr. King values discretion above all else. It would be wise for you to remember that." "Yes, ma'am," Rose said, lowering her eyes. As Miss Anders walked away, Rose clenched her fists. The walls were closing in, but she refused to back down. That evening, Rose sat alone in her tiny room in the staff quarters. The DNA test results were folded neatly on the small table beside her, a constant reminder of her mission. She picked up her phone and dialed Sarah's number. "Rose," Sarah said warmly, "how are you holding up?" "I got the results," Rose said, her voice trembling. "He's my son, Sarah. It's all there in black and white." Sarah's breath caught. "Oh, Rose, I'm so happy for you, but what are you going to do now?" "I don't know yet," Rose admitted. "Mr. King has so much power. I can't fight him alone." "You might not have to," Sarah said after a moment. "I've been thinking, if you go public with this, find a journalist or a lawyer willing to take your case, he won't be able to bury it. The court of public opinion can be powerful, even against someone like him." Rose hesitated. The thought of exposing her story to the world was terrifying, but Sarah had a point. Mr. King thrived in the shadows, where his money and influence could silence opposition. If she brought the truth into the light, he would have to answer for his actions. "I'll think about it," Rose said finally. "Just promise me you'll be careful," Sarah said. "And whatever you decide, I'll be here to help you." "Thank you, Sarah," Rose said, her voice soft. After hanging up, Rose sat in silence, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Going public would be risky, but it might be her only chance to reunite with Elijah. She glanced at the drawing Elijah had given her earlier. The simple crayon lines and bright colors were a testament to the bond they were already forming. "I'll fight for you," Rose whispered, "no matter what it takes." The next morning, the mansion hummed with its usual rhythm of tightly choreographed movements, but for Rose, everything felt heavier. Every step she took through the sprawling halls, every swipe of her dust cloth over polished surfaces, was a reminder of what was at stake. Elijah's words in the garden echoed in her mind. "Do you think my mommy misses me?" The ache in his voice had been unbearable, and the ache in her heart was worse. She carried the weight of her silence like a stone, knowing that the truth could change everything, but only if she wielded it carefully. As Rose made her way to the West Wing to begin her morning duties, she noticed Mrs. Ward standing near the grand staircase, her sharp eyes scanning the staff as they moved about. The head housekeeper's usual air of control was tinged with something else today, an edge of tension that made Rose's stomach tighten. "Parker!" Mrs. Ward barked, her voice cutting through the din. "Yes, ma'am?" Rose replied, stepping forward. "You'll be cleaning Mr. King's study this afternoon," Mrs. Ward said briskly. "He'll be out for meetings, and I expect it to be spotless when he returns. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Rose said, keeping her tone even. Mrs. Ward's piercing gaze lingered on her for a moment before she turned away, issuing more orders to the other staff. Rose's heart raced. The opportunity to be in Mr. King's study was both a risk and a chance. If there were any clues about how he had orchestrated Elijah's adoption, or proof of his lies, they would likely be in that room. Hours later, when the time came to clean the study, Rose found herself standing in front of the heavy oak door, her cleaning supplies balanced on the cart beside her. The weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her, but she forced herself to take a deep breath and push the door open. The study was a reflection of Mr. King's power: dark mahogany furniture, leather-bound books lining the shelves, and a massive desk that dominated the room. The air smelled faintly of his cologne, and sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Rose worked quickly, wiping down surfaces and dusting shelves, all while keeping an eye out for anything that might reveal the truth. Her hands shook as she opened the desk drawers one by one, careful not to disturb their arrangement. Most contained mundane items, pens, folders, and business papers, but in the bottom drawer, she found something that made her breath catch. A photograph. It was tucked between two files, its edges slightly worn. Rose's fingers trembled as she pulled it out and turned it over. Her heart stopped. The photo was of a newborn baby swaddled in a hospital blanket, his tiny face serene in sleep. Rose knew that face. She knew it in the deepest parts of her soul. Her son. She stared at the photograph, her vision blurring with tears. On the back, in faint handwriting, were the words, "Elijah, Day 1. Why would Mr. King keep this? Why would he hide it away? The sound of footsteps in the hallway jolted Rose from her thoughts. Panic surged through her as she quickly returned the photograph to the drawer, closed it, and resumed dusting the desk. The footsteps passed without incident, but Rose's heart continued to pound. She finished cleaning the study as quickly as she could, her mind racing with questions. If Mr. King had kept the photograph, did it mean he felt guilt for what he had done? Or was it simply a trophy of his victory, a reminder of the life he had stolen from her? Later that evening, Rose sat in her small room in the servants' quarters, the photograph burned into her memory. She had thought the DNA results would give her clarity, but instead, they had only deepened the mystery. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand and she grabbed it quickly, her heart leaping at the sight of Sarah's name. "Sarah," Rose said, her voice low. "I found something." "What is it?" Sarah asked, concern evident in her tone. "A photograph of Elijah as a newborn. It was in Mr. King's desk." Sarah was silent for a moment. "That's Strange. Why would he keep that? I don't know, Rose admitted, her voice breaking. But it proves that he's known all along. He's known that Elijah is my son. Rose, Sarah said gently, you need to be careful. If he finds out what you're doing. I know, Rose interrupted, tears spilling down her cheeks. But I can't stop now, Sarah. I have to fight for him. The days that followed were a blur of careful planning and quiet determination. Rose avoided Mr. King as much as possible, keeping her head down and her movements discreet. She spent her free moments gathering what little evidence she could find, piecing together a picture of the man who had stolen her son. It wasn't long before Mr. King began to notice. Miss Parker, he said one afternoon, stopping her in the hallway as she carried a tray of freshly laundered linens. Yes, sir, Rose replied, her heart racing. I've been watching you, he said, his tone deceptively casual. You're a hard worker, dedicated. Thank you, sir, Rose said carefully, unsure of where this was going. But I can't help but wonder, he continued, his dark eyes narrowing, why you seem so interested in my son. Rose's breath caught. She forced herself to meet his gaze, though her knees felt weak. I care about all the children in this house, sir, she said evenly. Elijah is a sweet boy. It's hard not to care about him. Mr. King studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Good. He needs people around him who care. As he walked away, Rose exhaled shakily. She had managed to deflect his suspicion for now, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. The turning point came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Most of the staff had been given the day off, leaving the mansion unusually empty. Rose used the opportunity to slip into the garden where she knew Elijah liked to play. She found him sitting under a large oak tree, drawing in a sketch pad with a set of colored pencils. Hello, Elijah, Rose said softly, approaching him. He looked up and smiled. Hi, Miss Rose. Look, I'm drawing the flowers. Rose sat beside him, watching as he carefully colored in the petals of a bright red rose. That's beautiful, she said. You're very talented. Elijah beamed at the praise, his small chest puffing up with pride. Daddy says I'm going to be an artist when I grow up. Rose's heart ached. You can be anything you want to be, she said gently. Do you think my mommy would like my drawings? Elijah asked suddenly, his voice tentative. Rose swallowed hard, her hands clenching the fabric of her skirt. I think she would love them, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Elijah smiled again, but there was a sadness in his eyes that broke Rose's heart. I hope I get to meet her someday. You will, Rose whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. I promise you will. Rose's promise to Elijah echoed in her heart long after she returned to the servants' quarters that evening. The words had come unbidden, but once spoken, they felt like a vow she could not break. She would find a way to be with her son, no matter the cost. The following days were marked by a strange shift in the mansion's atmosphere. Rose noticed the subtle tension in the air, the way staff whispered in corners and avoided eye contact with Mr. King. Even Mrs. Ward seemed unusually on edge, her normally sharp commands laced with an uncharacteristic stiffness. It wasn't long before Rose discovered the reason. Parker! Mrs. Ward snapped one morning, calling her over as Rose was polishing the grand staircase. Yes, ma'am, Rose replied, straightening up. You're needed in Mr. King's study, Mrs. Ward said, her tone clipped. He wants to speak with you, now. Rose's heart dropped. She nodded quickly, wiping her hands on her apron as she headed toward the study. Each step felt heavier than the last, her stomach twisting with a mixture of fear and resolve. When she reached the study, she found the door slightly ajar. She knocked softly before stepping inside. Mr. King stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the sprawling gardens. The sunlight highlighted the sharp angles of his face, making him appear even more imposing. You wanted to see me, sir? Rose asked, keeping her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. He turned slowly, his dark eyes locking onto hers, For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze assessing her in a way that made her feel exposed. "Yes, Miss Parker," he said finally, his voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I've been meaning to have a conversation with you." Rose swallowed hard, waiting for him to continue. "You've been with us for some time now," he said, moving to sit behind his massive desk. "And I must admit, your work has been satisfactory." "Thank you, sir," Rose said cautiously. "But I can't help but notice," he continued, leaning forward slightly, "that you seem to have taken a particular interest in my son." Rose's breath caught. She forced herself to remain calm, meeting his gaze head-on. "Elijah is a wonderful boy, sir," she said carefully. "It's hard not to care about him." Mr. King's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Suspicion, perhaps, or calculation. "Caring is one thing," he said. "But I must remind you of your place in this household. Your role is to serve, not to involve yourself in matters that do not concern you." Rose clenched her hands at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. "I understand, sir," she said, though her voice was tight. "Do you?" Mr. King's tone sharpened, and he rose from his chair, towering over her. "Because I'll be very clear, Miss Parker. My son's life is not your concern. If I find that you've overstepped your boundaries, you'll be dismissed immediately. Do I make myself clear?" Rose nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, sir." "Good." He sat back down, his expression cold and unyielding. "You may go." Rose turned and left the study, her heart pounding in her chest. The warning in his words was unmistakable, but so was the fear beneath her anger. Desmond King was a man who played to win, and she had just been reminded of the stakes. The next morning, Rose awoke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She reached for it groggily, squinting at the screen. It was Sarah. "Sarah?" Rose answered, her voice hoarse from sleep. "Rose, you need to be careful," Sarah said, her tone urgent. "I've been doing some digging, and it turns out Mr. King has friends in high places. Judges, lawyers, politicians. If he finds out what you're doing—" "I know," Rose interrupted, sitting up in bed. "But I can't stop now, Sarah. He's already threatened me, but I can't let that scare me off. Elijah is my son. I have to fight for him." Sarah sighed heavily. "Just promise me you'll be smart about this, Rose. If he finds out you have the DNA results—" "He won't," Rose said firmly, though the knot in her stomach told a different story. "I've been careful. No one knows except you." "Good," Sarah said, "because if he figures it out, he'll do everything in his power to discredit you. You can't let him get ahead of you." "I won't," Rose promised, though the weight of her words felt almost too heavy to bear. That afternoon, Rose was assigned to clean Elijah's room. The little boy wasn't there. He was at his weekly piano lesson, but his presence lingered in the small, personal touches scattered throughout the space. Rose moved methodically, dusting the shelves and tidying his desk. Her heart ached as she straightened the stack of books beside his bed, each one carefully selected by a father who had no right to claim him. As she worked, Rose's eyes fell on a small sketch pad lying on the nightstand. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up and flipping through its pages. The drawings inside were simple but heartfelt: flowers, animals, and, most often, a woman with curly hair standing beside a small boy. The figure of the woman was always the same, her kind eyes and warm smile drawn with the unsteady hand of a child. Rose's vision blurred with tears. Elijah had been dreaming of her, even without knowing who she was. She gently closed the sketch pad and set it back on the nightstand, wiping her eyes as she did so. The fight ahead would not be easy, but moments like this reminded her why she couldn't give up. The days stretched into a blur of tension and secrecy. Rose continued her duties, careful to avoid any further confrontations with Mr. King. She spoke only when spoken to, kept her head down, and poured all her energy into planning her next move. Then, one evening, everything changed. Rose had just finished her shift and was heading back to her quarters when she heard raised voices coming from the library. She paused in the hallway, her ears straining to catch the conversation. "You don't understand," a man's voice said urgently. "If this gets out, it could ruin everything." "I don't care," Mr. King's voice replied, cold and firm. "My son is all that matters. Do you understand me? Nothing else matters." Rose's heart pounded. She crept closer, careful not to make a sound. "What about the new maid?" the first voice asked. "What about her?" Mr. King replied, his tone dismissive. "She's been asking questions, getting too close to Elijah." There was a long pause and Rose held her breath. "Keep an eye on her," Mr. King said finally. "If she becomes a problem, we'll deal with her." Rose's blood ran cold. She backed away from the door and hurried down the hallway, her mind racing. The walls of the mansion, once grand and imposing, now felt like a cage closing in around her. She had to act quickly. The truth was on her side, but the longer she waited, the more dangerous her position became. As she entered her small room and locked the door behind her, Rose sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the DNA results to her chest. The time for waiting was over. David Jenkins leaned back in his chair, his kind eyes scanning the stack of evidence Rose had presented. The overhead light reflected off his glasses as he pressed his lips together, deep in thought. The cramped office, with its mismatched furniture and overstuffed filing cabinets, felt like a world away from the opulence of Desmond King's mansion. But for the first time in weeks, Rose felt a glimmer of hope. "Ms. Parker," Jenkins began, his voice calm but firm. "You're up against a very powerful opponent. I won't sugarcoat this. It's going to be a long and difficult fight. But what you've brought me here today, it's compelling. With this evidence and testimony, you have a real chance to expose what happened." Rose exhaled shakily, her grip on her manila envelope relaxing slightly. "You really think there's hope?" Jenkins nodded, leaning forward. "The DNA results alone are significant, but the additional documentation from your coworker Linda could be crucial in building your case, and if she's willing to testify, we'll have a strong narrative to present in court. Desmond King may have resources, but the truth is a powerful equalizer." Rose's heart swelled with gratitude, but fear quickly followed. "He's already threatened me," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "His lawyers are circling. I'm terrified of what he'll do next." Jenkins offered a reassuring smile. "That's how people like him operate, through intimidation. But don't forget, you have something he can't buy, the truth. And now, you have me in your corner." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a legal pad, scribbling a quick note. "I'll take your case on a contingency basis. That means you won't owe me a dime unless we win." Tears welled in Rose's eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jenkins held up a hand, his tone turning serious. "This won't be easy, Ms. Parker. Custody battles are complicated, even under normal circumstances. And with someone like Desmond King, you can expect an aggressive defense. He'll use every trick in the book to paint you as unfit, to discredit you." Rose's chest tightened, but she lifted her chin. "I don't care how hard it gets. I'm not giving up on my son." Jenkins nodded approvingly. "That's the kind of resolve we'll need. Now, the first step is filing a formal custody claim. I'll draft the necessary paperwork, but we'll need to act quickly. Once Mr. King is served, he'll likely escalate his tactics. Are you ready for that?" Rose hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I've already lost 5 years with Elijah. I won't let him take any more." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Rose spent every free moment at Jenkins' office, reviewing legal documents and compiling a detailed account of her story. Linda's testimony proved invaluable, and her handwritten notes provided a damning timeline of the events surrounding Elijah's adoption. "This is gold," Jenkins said one afternoon, holding up one of Linda's notes. "A paid-off judge and falsified death certificate? If we can prove this in court, Mr. King's entire defense will crumble. But despite the progress, Rose couldn't shake the looming fear that Desmond King would strike back. Every knock at her apartment door, every unknown number on her phone sent her heart racing. One evening, as Rose sat at her kitchen table poring over case files, her phone buzzed with a text message from Linda. "Be careful. There's been talk of hiring private investigators to dig into your past." Rose's stomach turned. She glanced around her small apartment, suddenly feeling exposed. "What could they possibly find on me?" she murmured to herself. Her life had been simple, uneventful, but the idea of strangers combing through her past made her skin crawl. She quickly texted Linda back, "Thank you for the warning. I'll be careful." Meanwhile, the tension at the mansion was palpable. Linda kept Rose updated on the household dynamics, and it was clear that Desmond King was preparing for war. "He's furious," Linda whispered during a phone call one night. "The staff is walking on eggshells. He's even called in extra security." Rose closed her eyes, clutching the phone tightly. "Does Elijah know what's going on?" "Not much," Linda replied. "But he's confused. He keeps asking about you, saying you're his mommy. It's breaking my heart, Rose. That boy loves you even if he doesn't fully understand what's happening." Rose's chest ached at the thought of Elijah being caught in the middle of this battle. "I have to protect him," she said softly, "no matter what it takes." The first official hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later. Rose arrived at the courthouse early, her nerves frayed but her resolve unshaken. Jenkins met her outside, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a confident expression. "You ready?" he asked. Rose nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "Ready as I'll ever be." The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, its wooden benches polished to a high sheen. Desmond King was already seated at the defense table, flanked by a team of high-powered attorneys. He didn't so much as glance in Rose's direction, but the tension radiating from him was unmistakable. As the proceedings began, Jenkins laid out the foundation of their case with a calm, methodical precision. He presented the DNA test results as irrefutable proof of Rose's biological connection to Elijah, and introduced Linda's testimony as evidence of the suspicious circumstances surrounding the adoption. Desmond's lead attorney, a polished woman with a sharp wit, countered with the argument that Elijah's adoption had been conducted legally, and that removing him from his current environment would be detrimental to his well-being. "Mr. King has provided a stable, loving home for Elijah," she argued. "This claim is nothing more than an attempt to disrupt that stability for personal gain." Rose clenched her fists under the table, biting back a retort. She knew this was only the beginning. As the hearing adjourned, Rose stepped outside the courthouse, the weight of the day settling on her shoulders. Jenkins joined her, his expression neutral but encouraging. "They're going to fight dirty," he warned, "but we have the facts on our side. Don't lose hope." Rose nodded, her determination unwavering. She glanced across the street and spotted Desmond standing by a sleek black car, his posture rigid and his gaze fixed on her. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Rose saw the fury simmering beneath his calm exterior. She refused to look away, meeting his gaze with equal intensity. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a fight for her son's future. The weeks that followed were a relentless tug-of-war. Each court hearing brought new challenges, and Desmond King's legal team spared no expense in attempting to discredit Rose. Their tactics ranged from subtle digs at her financial instability to outright accusations that she was unfit to parent Elijah. "She lacks the resources to provide for a child," Desmond's lead attorney argued during one particularly grueling session. "Mr. King has given Elijah a stable home, access to the best education, and opportunities that Ms. Parker simply cannot match." Rose sat stiffly at her table, her hands clenched together as Jenkins rose to counter. "With all due respect," Jenkins began, his voice calm but firm, "parenting isn't about material wealth. It's about love, care, and connection. Ms. Parker has spent the last 5 years grieving for a child she was told had died, a lie orchestrated by Mr. King. She deserves the chance to know her son and to let him know her. Desmond shifted in his seat, his expression cold and unyielding. Rose could feel the weight of his anger pressing down on her, but she refused to falter. Outside the courtroom, the tension between Rose and Desmond reached a boiling point. One afternoon, as Rose and Jenkins exited the building, Desmond approached them, his towering figure casting a long shadow on the courthouse steps. "Rose," he said, his tone deceptively calm. "A word." Jenkins immediately stepped forward. "If you have something to say, Mr. King, you can say it in front of me." Desmond ignored him, his piercing gaze locked on Rose. "You're making a mistake," he said. "This fight isn't going to end the way you think it will." Rose lifted her chin, her resolve hardening. "The only mistake I made was trusting you 5 years ago. I won't make that mistake again." Desmond's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked away, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement. Jenkins placed a reassuring hand on Rose's shoulder. "Don't let him rattle you," he said. "He wants you to feel intimidated. That's how people like him operate." Rose nodded, though her heart was pounding. She couldn't afford to show any weakness. Not now, not ever. Back at her apartment, Rose tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the stress of the custody battle weighed heavily on her. She spent her evenings reviewing legal documents, working late shifts to make ends meet, and replaying every interaction with Elijah in her mind. Her small living room had been transformed into a makeshift war room. Stacks of papers covered the coffee table, alongside photographs, handwritten notes, and a carefully organized timeline of events. Linda visited often, offering both emotional support and insider information about the mansion. "He misses you," Linda said one evening as she sipped tea from a chipped mug. "Elijah talks about you all the time. He's been drawing pictures of you, you know." Rose's chest tightened. "What kind of pictures?" "Mostly of the two of you together," Linda said softly. "He draws you holding hands or sitting in the garden. He even drew one of you hugging him. It's like he knows Rose. He feels the connection." Tears pricked Rose's eyes, but she blinked them away. "I just want him to know the truth," she whispered. "I want him to know he's loved." Linda reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "He already knows, Rose. But you're going to have to be strong. Desmond isn't going to give up without a fight." The next hearing was perhaps the most difficult yet. Desmond's legal team had uncovered details from Rose's past that they twisted into ammunition against her. "Ms. Parker has struggled with financial instability for years," the lead attorney declared. "She's moved frequently, held multiple low-paying jobs, and is currently facing eviction. These are not the conditions in which a child can thrive." Rose's cheeks burned with shame, but she refused to let their words break her. She glanced at Jenkins, who gave her a small nod before rising to speak. "Financial hardship is not a crime," Jenkins said firmly, "nor does it define a person's worth as a parent. Ms. Parker has worked tirelessly to provide for herself despite overwhelming obstacles, and that determination is precisely what makes her a capable and loving mother." The judge listened intently, his expression unreadable. Rose's hands tightened in her lap as the attorney continued. "What about her absence from Elijah's life for the past 5 years?" the attorney pressed. "She claims to be his mother, yet she has no relationship with him." Jenkins didn't miss a beat. "That absence was not of Ms. Parker's choosing," he said, his voice sharp. "She was deliberately deceived into believing her son had died. If not for Mr. King's actions, she would have been in Elijah's life from the beginning." Desmond's attorney attempted to interrupt, but Jenkins held firm. "Let's not forget who orchestrated this situation in the first place. Ms. Parker is here today because she refuses to let Mr. King's lies keep her from her son any longer." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Jenkins' words hanging in the air. As the weeks dragged on, Rose found solace in the small moments she was able to share with Elijah. Court-ordered visitation allowed her limited time with him, but each meeting was a precious gift. One sunny afternoon, they sat together in a park near the courthouse. Elijah held her hand tightly as they walked along the path, his small fingers laced with hers. "Miss Rose," he said, looking up at her with wide eyes. "Why does my daddy get so mad when I talk about you?" Rose's heart ached. She knelt down to his level, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Sometimes grown-ups don't know how to handle their feelings," she said gently. "But what's important is that you know I'm here for you no matter what." Elijah nodded solemnly, his little face thoughtful. "I like being with you," he said. "It feels safe." Rose pulled him into a tight hug, her tears hidden against his curls. "I like being with you too, sweetheart," she whispered. The final hearing loomed on the horizon, and the pressure mounted with each passing day. Jenkins worked tirelessly, piecing together a compelling case that exposed the full extent of Desmond's deceit. Linda's testimony proved invaluable, and the evidence she had collected painted a damning picture of Desmond's actions. Still, Rose couldn't shake the fear that Desmond's influence would tip the scales against her. He had money, power, and connections, resources that far outweighed her own. One evening, as Rose sat in Jenkins' office reviewing the final draft of their opening statement, she voiced her concerns. "What if the court sides with him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they decide Elijah is better off with him?" Jenkins set down his pen and looked her in the eye. "The law isn't perfect, Rose," he admitted. "But it's not just about the law, it's about what's right. And what's right is for Elijah to know his mother." Rose nodded, her resolve hardening. She couldn't afford to think about failure. She had come too far, fought too hard, to let Desmond win. The day of the final hearing arrived with an air of anticipation that hung heavy in the courthouse. Reporters lined the steps, their cameras flashing as Rose and Jenkins made their way inside. Desmond arrived shortly after, his expression unreadable as he strode past the crowd with his team of attorneys. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Both sides presented their arguments with fervor, and the judge listened intently, his face giving away nothing. When it was finally Rose's turn to speak, she stood slowly, her knees trembling but her voice steady. "Your Honor," she began, "I may not have wealth or power, but I have something far more important. Love. Elijah is my son. I carried him. I gave birth to him. And I have spent every day since mourning the years we lost. All I want is the chance to know him, to love him, and to be the mother he deserves." Her voice broke, but she pressed on. "I'm not perfect, but I will fight for my son with everything I have, because no child should ever grow up without knowing how much they are loved." As Rose sat down, she caught a glimpse of Elijah in the gallery, his wide eyes fixed on her. In that moment, she knew that no matter what happened, she had done everything she could. The tension in the courtroom was so thick, it was almost suffocating. As the judge prepared to deliver his ruling, Rose clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Beside her, Jenkins gave her a subtle nod of reassurance, but the weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on her chest. Desmond sat across the aisle, his posture rigid, his face an unreadable mask. His legal team whispered among themselves, their confidence evident in their smug expressions. But Rose refused to let herself be intimidated. No matter the outcome, she had spoken the truth, and that truth was her anchor. The judge cleared his throat, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "This case presents a unique and complex set of circumstances," he began, his tone measured. "On one side, we have Mr. King, a man of substantial means who has provided the child Elijah with a life of material stability and opportunity. On the other side, we have Ms. Parker, a mother who has been unfairly deprived of her son due to circumstances outside her control." Rose's heart pounded in her chest as the judge continued. "While financial resources and stability are important factors in determining the best interests of the child, they are not the sole considerations. The court must also weigh the emotional and psychological needs of the child, as well as the biological connection between parent and child." Desmond's attorney stood, clearly ready to interject, but the judge raised a hand, silencing her. After reviewing the evidence and testimony, it is clear to this court that Mr. King acted with deliberate intent to deceive Ms. Parker and deny her rightful place in her son's life. Such actions are deeply troubling and demonstrate a disregard for the basic principles of honesty and justice. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Rose felt a flicker of hope ignite in her chest. However, the judge continued, his tone heavy, the court must also consider the potential impact of disrupting Elijah's current living arrangements. It is not in the child's best interest to be subjected to a sudden and dramatic change in environment without a proper transition period. Rose's breath caught. She clutched the edge of the table, her pulse racing. Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that Ms. Parker shall be granted joint custody of Elijah King, the judge declared. A transition plan will be implemented to allow Ms. Parker and Elijah to build a relationship while maintaining stability in his life. Both parties are expected to cooperate fully with this arrangement, as the well-being of the child is paramount. The gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing. For a moment, Rose couldn't process what she had just heard. Joint custody. She would be able to see her son, to spend time with him, to be his mother in every way that mattered. Tears filled her eyes as she turned to Jenkins, who gave her a rare smile. "We did it," he said simply. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of reporters had gathered, their cameras flashing as Rose stepped onto the sidewalk. She ignored their questions, her focus entirely on the little boy standing a few feet away. "Elijah," she said softly, kneeling down and opening her arms. He hesitated for only a moment before running to her, his small arms wrapping tightly around her neck. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice muffled against her shoulder. Rose held him close, her tears spilling onto his curls. "I love you so much, sweetheart," she murmured. "I've always loved you." Desmond watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Rose thought she saw something resembling regret in his eyes, but she couldn't be sure. Linda approached, a warm smile on her face as she watched the reunion. "You did it, Rose," she said quietly. "You fought for him, and you won." Rose looked down at Elijah, his small hand now clasped firmly in hers. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Co-parenting with Desmond would come with its own set of challenges, and there were still wounds that needed time to heal. But for now, she allowed herself to savor this moment, the culmination of months of fear, determination, and love. "Come on, sweetheart," she said to Elijah, her voice steady. "Let's go home." Over the following weeks, Rose and Elijah began to build their relationship one small step at a time. Their first few visits were supervised, but the awkwardness quickly melted away as they spent more time together. Rose discovered that Elijah loved to draw, just as she had when she was a child. They spent hours at the kitchen table, creating colorful masterpieces together. "Look, Mommy," Elijah said one afternoon, holding up a drawing of a house surrounded by flowers. "That's us, and that's our garden." Rose smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "It's beautiful, Elijah. You're such a talented artist." He beamed at her, his smile lighting up the room. For the first time in years, Rose felt whole. Co-parenting with Desmond was far from easy. Their interactions were tense, and the animosity between them lingered like a storm cloud. But they managed to keep their focus on Elijah, putting his needs above their own conflicts. One evening, as Rose picked Elijah up from the mansion, Desmond stopped her at the door. "Rose," he said, his tone unusually subdued. She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "Yes?" Desmond hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before meeting hers. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Rose blinked, caught off guard. "For what?" "For everything," he admitted, his voice strained. "For lying to you, for taking Elijah from you. I thought I was doing the right thing at the time, but I see now that I was wrong." Rose stared at him, her emotions a jumble of anger, disbelief, and a faint glimmer of something resembling forgiveness. "It's not me you need to apologize to," she said finally. "It's Elijah." Desmond nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'll do better," he said. "For him." Rose gave a small nod before turning to leave, Elijah's hand in hers. She didn't know if Desmond's words were genuine, but for now, they were enough. Months later, Rose stood in the garden of her new home, watching as Elijah ran through the grass with a kite trailing behind him. The modest house wasn't much, but it was hers. A fresh start for both of them. "Careful, sweetheart," she called out, laughing as the kite dipped and soared. Elijah grinned at her, his joy infectious. "Look, Mommy, it's flying so high." Rose smiled, her heart full. The journey to this moment had been long and painful, but it had been worth every step. She looked down at the photograph in her hand, the same hospital photo she had shown Elijah that day in his room. It was crumpled and worn, but it was a reminder of how far they had come. Tucking the photo into her pocket, Rose joined Elijah in the yard, her laughter mingling with his as they chased the kite together. For the first time in years, she felt free. The quiet hum of the car's engine filled the air as Rose glanced at Elijah, who sat beside her, clutching his stuffed elephant tightly. His little legs swung back and forth, his eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty, as the city streets blurred past the window. Rose reached over and gently placed a hand on his. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Elijah turned to her, his expression tentative. "Is this really our house, Mommy? The one we're going to live in together?" "Yes, baby," Rose replied, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not as big as where you were before, but it's ours, and I promise we'll make it a home filled with love." Elijah nodded, seeming to relax a little. "I don't care if it's big," he said earnestly. "I just want to be with you." Tears stung Rose's eyes, but she blinked them away, focusing on the road ahead. The small house she'd managed to secure was modest, tucked in a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, a fresh start for her and Elijah. When they pulled into the driveway, Elijah's eyes lit up. "This is it?" he asked, practically bouncing in his seat. "This is it," Rose confirmed, smiling as she opened her door. Elijah scrambled out of the car and ran up to the front porch, his excitement contagious. Rose followed, carrying a few bags of groceries and the last remnants of her old life. Inside, the house was cozy but welcoming. The walls were painted a warm cream color, and the hardwood floors gleamed in the late afternoon sunlight. The kitchen was small but functional, with cheerful yellow curtains framing the window above the sink. Elijah darted from room to room, exploring every corner with wide-eyed wonder. "Mommy, there's a yard," he called out, pressing his face against the back door's glass pane. Rose chuckled, setting the groceries on the counter. "We'll plant some flowers together," she said. "Maybe even a little vegetable garden." "A garden?" Elijah spun around, his excitement palpable. "Can we grow carrots? And strawberries?" "Anything you want, sweetheart," Rose said, her heart swelling. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer threatened to crush her. This house, this life, was the beginning of something new, something beautiful. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rose and Elijah sat together at the small kitchen table. Dinner was simple, spaghetti with store-bought sauce and a salad, but to Rose, it felt like a feast. Elijah twirled a forkful of noodles, his face serious. "Mommy, will Daddy ever come to this house?" Rose paused, her heart aching at the question. "Do you want him to come, Elijah?" she asked gently. "I don't know," Elijah admitted, his brow furrowed. "Sometimes I miss him, but I like it here with you." Rose reached across the table and took his hand. "It's okay to have complicated feelings," she said. "You can love both of us, and that's okay. One day, if you want, we can talk about letting him visit. But only if you're ready." Elijah nodded slowly, seeming to process her words. "Okay," he said finally. The days passed in a blur of adjustments and new routines. Elijah started at a nearby school, where he quickly made friends and charmed his teachers with his sweet nature and artistic talent. Rose found work cleaning houses, her flexible schedule allowing her to be there for Elijah before and after school. Every morning, they walked hand in hand to the bus stop, and every afternoon, they worked in the garden together. The yard soon blossomed with colorful flowers and rows of vegetables, a tangible representation of the life they were building together. One afternoon, as they watered the plants, Elijah looked up at Rose with a thoughtful expression. "Mommy, do you think Daddy misses me?" he asked. Rose hesitated, her hands stilling on the watering can. "I think he does, Elijah," she said carefully. "Even though he made mistakes, I know he loves you in his own way." Elijah nodded, his face serious. "I think I want to see him someday, just to talk." Rose crouched down beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "When you're ready, we'll make that happen," she promised. True to his word, Desmond had respected the boundaries Rose had set. His letter, sent a month after the court ruling, remained tucked in Rose's desk drawer. She hadn't responded yet, unsure of how to navigate the complicated emotions his apology stirred. In the letter, he had written, "I deeply regret the choices I made, and I understand that I've caused you both immeasurable pain. Nothing I say can undo the past, but I want to do better for Elijah. I've created a trust fund for his future, and I hope it can be a small step toward making amends. I'll respect your wishes regarding visitation and will wait until you feel the time is right." Rose read the letter often, her feelings toward Desmond shifting from anger to cautious understanding. He had done terrible things, but his remorse seemed genuine. Still, forgiveness wouldn't come easily, and she wasn't ready to let him back into Elijah's life just yet. One evening, as Rose tucked Elijah into bed, he reached out and took her hand. "Mommy?" "Yes, sweetheart?" "I'm glad you found me," he said, his voice soft. Rose's heart swelled with emotion. "I'm glad I found you too," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "I love you more than anything in the world." Elijah smiled, his eyes growing heavy with sleep. "I love you too, Mommy." As she sat beside him, watching him drift off, Rose felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey to this moment had been painful and fraught with challenges, but it had been worth every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. She had her son back. And together they were building a life filled with love, laughter, and hope. Months passed, and the little house became a true home. Elijah thrived in school, filling the walls with colorful drawings and the yard with laughter as he played. Rose found joy in the small, quiet moments, cooking together, working in the garden, and tucking him into bed every night. Desmond, true to his word, stayed distant, allowing Rose and Elijah the time and space they needed. Eventually, with Elijah's encouragement, Rose wrote back to him. The letter was simple, but firm. "Elijah is happy and safe. When he's ready, we'll talk about supervised visits. Until then, I hope you'll continue to respect our boundaries." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. One crisp autumn morning, Rose and Elijah stood in their blooming garden admiring the bright orange pumpkins they'd grown together. "Can we carve these for Halloween, Mommy?" Elijah asked, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Of course," Rose said, kneeling to inspect the largest one. "You can pick the design." As they worked side by side, the sun warm on their faces, Rose realized just how far they had come. She had fought for her son and reclaimed the life they were meant to share. The scars of the past would always remain, but they no longer defined her. Together, they had built something stronger than anything money could buy, a bond of love and resilience that nothing could break. And as Elijah's laughter rang out, mixing with the rustle of the wind, Rose knew one thing for certain. They had finally found their forever home.